Imagine for a second that you are a scientific advisor for the UK government in October 2020. Science is your passion, your career is your life's work, and now you have to put all that past experience to the test in the wake of this COVID-19 pandemic. Citizens of the country are losing their lives, hospitals are overflowing. You feel the weight of the responsibility heavy on your shoulders as you step into number 10. It's your job to give this government all the information it needs to make the best possible decisions for the people of the UK during this crisis, and so you've come prepared. You walk into the government meeting, and in your hands you carry a short stack of papers. It's a pile of memos, one to hand out to each of the attendees. On every memo, you've swiftly and concisely condensed the information pertaining to a uniquely disturbing update from the burgeoning world of COVID science. It seems that a concerning number of people are contracting COVID-19, but they're never fully recovering from it. It goes without saying that the potential consequences for a long-lasting illness like this sweeping through the nation are disastrous. The memos are handed out, the meeting begins, and all your focus is channeled into the here and now. The fate of the United Kingdom is at stake, and there is nothing more important than this moment. But something does distract you, something you scarcely believe you're seeing. You glance over the table to where the Prime Minister has set his memo down in front of him. He has written on it, in bold, black Sharpie, right across the face of the page, he has written one word: bollocks. Okay, so I may have taken some artistic liberties with that description, but something like that did actually happen. Boris Johnson did write over a memo he was given that contained information about long COVID. And he didn't just write bollocks on it either. What he actually wrote was, and I quote, bollocks, this is Gulf War Syndrome stuff. So, way to throw not one, but two groups of people with medically unexplained illness under the bus with that one. That was not a very wise or compassionate decision now, was it, Boris? Pretty early on in the pandemic, as you very well know, it became clear that some people were staying sick after getting the virus. For some of them, their lingering symptoms could be explained by the organ damage they sustained from an acute infection, and that damage could be picked up on scans. But for others, scans and various other medical tests picked up nothing of note, and yet they were still ill. Within this subgroup of patients, a large chunk of them suffered from the same symptoms post-infection. They were struck by a debilitating fatigue so strong that the word fatigue could not fully explain it, and their condition seemed, paradoxically, to be made even worse through exercise, with symptoms increasing in severity between a few hours and up to 2 days after exertion. As well as this, they suffered from cognitive difficulties, disturbed and unrefreshing sleep, pain, and a whole host of other symptoms. For some, their condition was so bad they were left bedbound. People who were previously athletes were scarcely able to walk. It even affected children, though most of these patients, it must be observed, were women and people of colour. The world was facing a new health crisis, and time was of the essence to figure out the underlying pathology behind this long COVID so that its sufferers might be delivered effective treatments as soon as possible. And who better to fund this medical research that would bring these treatments about than the world's biggest funder of medical research, the National Institute of Health? In February 2021, the NIH launched its $1 billion initiative to study long COVID, and it set out three distinct goals for itself: to find the biological causes of long COVID, to determine how many people are impacted by it, and to identify treatments. And what did the NIH spend the vast majority of this research money on? That's right, they spend it on the NIH's favourite. I'm talking low risk, low reward, observational research. They were observing the shit out of those patients. It was like the bloody panopticon at the NIH. At this time, there were researchers who were poised to use their expertise to study long COVID, the types of people who have focused their careers into studying post-viral illnesses like ME, POTS, and mast cell activation syndrome, people like Ron Davies and his team. So, of course, the NIH absolutely did not include these people in leading the Recover project. The vast majority of the Recover project's finances actually went to people who had no prior experience in studying post-viral illnesses at all. But regardless, while all of this research was going on, we still had to find some way of helping all of these long COVID patients. I mean, there were so many of them, and the numbers were just growing exponentially. So, what could be done for them? What treatment do you give patients suffering from a post viral illness when you don't even understand the pathology behind their sickness? Medics scrambled to find something helpful to offer these patients, but they didn't have to look long. As luck would have it, a UK trial was published just 9 years prior to the COVID outbreak, which tested out treatments for a very similar looking post viral illness. And it found that GET and CBT can actually lead to like 22% of patients making a full recovery. So, for many long COVID patients all around the world, courses of GET were handed out along with the promise that full recovery is completely possible if they were willing to put the effort in. Yet, as the years passed, as these patients mysteriously continued to be sick and somehow got even worse when they did GET, who could have seen that coming, research finally began to be released and the mystery of long COVID started to unravel. And what did all of this research find? When you took a closer look, what was going on in this subgroup of patients who were experiencing this debilitating fatigue? Well, researchers found that their bodies, their muscles and cells failed to respond to exercise, just like in ME. And they found that these patients had more micro blood clots on average, just like ME, and that their innate immune system was perpetually activated, and that they were experiencing T cell exhaustion, and that they had problems with their blood brain barrier and the endothelial layer of blood vessels, and problems with gut bacteria, and that it was potentially partly caused by viral reactivation, just like ME. In fact, this illness was so strikingly similar to ME that calls were quickly made to make use of past ME research to guide future long COVID research. But what a shame that this body of past ME research is so much smaller than it could have been. And then some people said, wait, hold on a second. If there's no diagnostic test for long COVID, and if routine medical tests come back just fine for these patients, then are these people even really sick? I mean, we all get fatigued sometimes. It's not unusual to be tired, especially when you're recovering from a virus. How unfortunate it was that the illness most similar to long COVID was one that was so poorly understood by the general public and which medics were so poorly educated about. Patients were left adrift in their confusion, often with little to no support, and the lack of understanding of their illness all too often led to them being accused of fabricating it. And this problem of disbelief was so widespread that some of the parents of children with long COVID were accused of fabricating or exaggerating their own child's illness. Women were labeled as being hysterical mothers, and in some cases, diagnoses of FII or FND, previously known as hysteria, were thrown around. At times, social services became involved, and some of these parents were threatened to have their children taken away from them. Some people were so convinced that long COVID was, at its core, some kind of mass hysteria that they believed it could be spread just by talking about it. In January 2021, the journalist George Monbiot published an article in The Guardian in which he voiced his concern for the growing wave of long COVID patients and the lack of support on offer for them. And in response, he was blamed for spreading long COVID by talking about it by none other than Michael Sharp. In a PowerPoint presentation he delivered to Swiss Re, a company which, according to its website, is one of the world's leading providers of reinsurance, insurance, and other forms of insurance-based risk transfer, Michael Sharp quoted George Monbiot's article in the section where he spoke about what causes post-COVID syndrome. You just know that it would be really, really embarrassing for Michael Sharp if the slides from this PowerPoint presentation were made public or, God forbid, even included in a video essay series exploring this whole medical scandal. But unfortunately for him, with an internet connection and access to Apple iMovie, anything is possible. And also in George Monbiot's article where he responds to Michael Sharp, he included a link to the PowerPoint slides. So what we're going to do now is just rapid fire go through some of my favourite slides from this presentation together. In the section of the presentation that talks about what causes post-COVID syndrome, there's a slide that talks about biological factors, which at first glance seems normal, but then the third bullet point says effects of coping behaviour, e.g. resting. And then the next two slides after that, it talks about psychological factors. And under that heading, the 3 bullet points read, quote, seeing bodily sensations as alarming and focusing on them, becoming anxious and then experiencing more symptoms, significant anxiety in a high proportion of patients, and coping, including avoidance and seeking medical care. Like, forget anxiety caused by a chronic post-infectious disease that destroys your life and that no one believes you about. I'm getting secondhand embarrassment and anxiety by just reading through these slides. Anyways, the next slide under the heading Social Factors, we can find that quote from George Monbiot's article. So apparently George Monbiot is just spreading long COVID by writing about how concerned he is about it. Then on the next slide, which is so shocking, under the heading Social Factors Support Groups, there's just a bunch of graphics of logos made by or advertising support groups. So Michael Sharp here seems to insist that these support groups are bad things that will make long COVID worse somehow. Then if we skip to the section of the presentation where it talks about how can we treat post-COVID syndrome, it points out that there are similarities with other illnesses such as chronic fatigue syndrome, CFS/ME, and then on the next slide it quotes the fucking PACE trial. And then on the slide after that it just says, quote, at present the best treatment is psychologically informed rehabilitation. And then on another slide, under the heading Challenges in Providing Rehabilitation, there is literally a picture of a graphic that says NICE Clinical Guidelines Publication and Consultation 2020, and it has the ME Association's logo on it. And on the final slide we'll be looking at, under the heading Outcome of Long COVID, the last bullet point reads, quote, reasonable guess is 1% will have long-term disability, which that must have been such a big relief for Swiss Re to hear, I am sure. By the way, Michael Sharp is currently a professor of psychology at Oxford University. This is more than just shameful. This is embarrassing. This whole story is so fucking embarrassing when you put it in the context of what preceded it. It's like a stack of dominoes were lined up and we've just watched them all fall. I think in the wake of the pandemic, we're left with a lot of confusion and hurt, of course, but we're also left with questions. To me, two of the most important questions are, how could something like this happen? And where do we go from here? The first question I hope I've helped to answer at least in part by now through my previous videos, and the second question is what we're going to be focusing on for our last few episodes. I'll see you there.